So, John, please take it away.
Okay, thank you, Maureen, and thank you to all of you within the sound of my voice for this opportunity to share some insights I have on the Space Force. I must admit the technology challenges that Maureen and I worked through yesterday have left this feeling, for me anyway, like what a radio broadcaster must feel. You can hear my voice, I can't see you, but you will be able to see my slides. I would. As you'll note in the title of the presentation, I have ad-libbed a bit from Star Wars in the title, and there is a bit of humor that has been going around on late nights for those who watch that thing about the Space Force, as well as within the Space Force organization itself, which is really a sign of, I think, camaraderie as standing up this new organization with its own culture. But it is a very serious subject, and a little bit about my background in this area. I've been involved with the space business now for over 40 years. In the first part of my career in the 70s, after graduating in physics from university, I had the privilege of being part of the team that worked the prototypical GPS program. If one can, this probably dates me, but before there was a GPS, we actually had to put up some test satellites to prove that the concept worked before the Congress would fund us.
Now I'm on mute.
And the exciting part of that was it actually worked, as you can see today. And from there, I was involved in a variety of organizations, typically as a corporate fix-it kind of a guy, but then ended my full-time career as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Space Intelligence, as well as nuclear matters. And today I do some consulting with the department. So going back to, by way of context, the world as it was in those early days for me, and I think for most of us in this business, space was really the high frontier, literally. And there was a certain sense of invulnerability. There was technical competition, certainly amongst the nations involved, of which there were few at that time. But there wasn't this sense of foreboding of threats to our space assets. And today, there's over 170 countries that have some form of space capability, 11 of whom can actually launch satellites. And there's new satellites, sometimes as many as 60 in one launch for some of the commercial folks just about every week. In orbit today, there are an active some 3,000 satellites, and some 2,000 of which, in addition to that, are dead in orbit. And there is some maneuvering one has to do occasionally to avoid collisions, although that doesn't happen very often. Within the U.S., in the military and intelligence world, there's over 100 satellites in orbit, providing very critical national security capabilities. But our adversaries are developing and have developed various weapon systems that have the potential capability to, in fact, deny, degrade, or destroy our capabilities. And why are they doing this? And this is a key point of understanding in this discussion, is these space capabilities are tightly coupled and integrated with capabilities of our defensive as well as war-making capabilities on the ground. And so our adversaries, of course, recognize this, and they are developing capabilities, in fact, faster than we are, to erode our lead in space. And that is, in fact, why the Space Force was established, in order to address this issue. So the topics I'd like to cover today, as Maureen mentioned, just a word about security. I'm going to say very little about the things the U.S. is doing in this domain, other than to talk organizationally about what the Space Force is doing. We will talk about, based on publicly available information, and within the brief, you'll notice various website references where, if you want to look for further info, you'll find some very useful information. When we get to the Q&A session, should a question come up, and I have to say I really can't comment on that, that just means we've gotten outside the security boundaries of this, but I think we can still have a very meaningful presentation. The whole question of what are the threats, the so-called counterspace threats. Back in July, I gave a presentation solely on this subject, so this is a brief refresher for those who happen to participate in that. And then we'll talk about the Space Force and how it's addressing these threats. And then we'll end on what I would call some important and in many cases humorous cultural actions being taken to stand up the Space Force. So first, talking about counterspace threats. U.S. capabilities today depend upon space. You can see there's a variety of orbits that our satellite systems occupy, from 2,000 kilometers of altitude up to 36,000 at geosynchronous. The missions noted in red are those that are the purview of the U.S. Space Force. Intelligence as well as human spaceflight are integrated as part of the discussion of the Space Force, but are not directly under control other than in wartime for intelligence. And both government as well as commercial assets are under threat. You're reading the various news articles and papers. The government is purchasing commercial space capabilities in ever greater numbers to support the various missions. And so hence they are under threat as well. The intelligence community assessment of space threats is shown on this slide. First at the top with a quote from Dan Coates, the recent director of national intelligence, citing both Russia and China as pursuing anti-satellite weapons as a means to reduce our military effectiveness. And along the bottom part of the slide, those threats run the range from ground-based jammers to cyber attacks to lasers, co-orbital threats, which means killer satellites, if you want to use that term, interceptors, which is an interesting concept. A number of U.S. companies are standing up the capability to put satellites in orbit that can refuel and refurbish other satellites and keep them mission capable longer. But with that ability to intercept also comes the ability of our adversaries to potentially put a device on one of our satellites or do damage or harm to it. There's the threat against ground sites, which is a real threat should someone decide to go do that. And then there's what I think of as the kamikaze approach, which is a nuclear detonation in space, which would basically kill everybody's satellite system. And so we have a whole range of threats that we have to address. Let's talk about China first. China tends to have a perspective that is long range. It tends to be very well considered and proportional in most cases. And so they view their counterspace operations as a means to deter and counter potential intervention during a regional military conflict. As per their usual bluster that they have when they like to get your attention, they also say that the targets of those attacks are going to be blinded and deafened. But that said, my sense is that they are much more measured in their response or their potential response. In 2015, China stood up its own Space Force. And in terms of capabilities, we will build out this chart for each of for China, then Russia, and then a couple of other competitors, Iran, as well as North Korea. Along the left-hand side is the capabilities. In green are those things that are defensive in nature, the ability to launch, the ability to do position, navigation, and timing. Read that as a GPS-like system. Missile warning, communications, intelligence, and space situational awareness, which is the ability to know where your opponents or your adversaries' space assets are, what their capabilities are, And that's colored kind of a mixed shade of green for defensive and red for counterspace, because once you know where the other guy's assets are, you could in fact deploy a threat, and those threats are indicated at the bottom in terms of cyberspace, kinetic, directed energy, laser type weapons, electronic warfare, as well as orbital kinds of threats. And then in the China column, as an example, OP stands for operational capability, and DEV or DEV is a developmental capability, still in test or prototype. But as you can see, China has a very capable set of both defensive as well as offensive capabilities. The details of which we really can't get into, but that gives you a sense of those. Turning to Russia, Russia's counterspace approach. The Russians tend to be much more aggressive in their posturing. They pursue counterspace systems to neutralize or deny our systems. They view it as a way of deterring adversaries that are relying on space. But in their case, if the deterrence fails, Russia's basically going to go at you full force. They have this whole construct of escalate to de-escalate, so go big at the beginning, and then as they get their way, back down from that. So again, it's a much more immediate and belligerent kind of a viewpoint. I think it would be a fair way of describing Russian perspectives on space warfare. The Russians also stood up a space force in 2015. And in terms of their capabilities, side by side against the Chinese, they are basically in the same place as the Chinese, with the exception of kinetic energy threats. So those are in development. China, in fact, has demonstrated, I believe in 2007, they blew one of their own satellites out of orbit as a demonstration. The Russians have not yet done that. And there's a whole discussion about whether that's even an appropriate way to do things in terms, particularly of testing, because once you blow something up, it stays in orbit forever and becomes a threat to everybody. But as you can see, China and Russia are very aggressively developing or have in operation these capabilities. And then shifting to Iran and North Korea, both are very early into this stuff. Iran has a launch capability. It's basically, as in the case of Korea, for satellite launching purposes. Those launchers are actually ICBMs or ICBM prototypes, just like the U.S. had early on, and they're using that as a means of potentially having orbital capabilities. Both have a space situational awareness. The Koreans haven't developed some kinetic energy threats, and also they have a significant jamming capability in the electronic warfare arena. So to kind of summarize the threat space, it really is a continuum from things that are reversible, like space situational awareness or jamming, things that can be partially destructive, like directed energy or cyberspace, and then things that are all out going to be irreversible, such as an attack on a ground site, or even, as I mentioned earlier, a nuclear detonation. And so space being such an element of an integrated battlefield for the U.S., it's really, as a Navy commander pointed out to me a few years back, people like to talk about the war in space. There is going to be, if there is a war, it will be a war. It will include space, but it will also include things on the ground. And so space is an integrated part of that battle space and field. So let's talk about the Space Force and how it's going to respond to these threats and how it's structured. So the first question is, why do we need a Space Force? Well, first of all, the threats we just talked about are developing faster than our ability to respond. We need a new and agile acquisition, test, and fielding process. as General John Hyten, who ran Space Command in one of his prior jobs and is now our Vice Chief of Staff, has said a number of times, we just can't take 7 to 10 years to field a new space capability. And our acquisition process today tends to have absolute avoidance of risk. This is an environment in which prudent risk needs to be empowered in terms of the program leaders and authorized. And for failures in the case of prudent risk, you don't go out and look for the program manager to go kill when it happens, or you set a cultural norm, kind of like we have today, that you better not fail or you're toast in your career. And so there's that uniqueness of culture and of acquisition that needs to take place. It's different, really, than what exists in the Air Force and other services. Space is, in fact, a domain of its own. It's similar in that respect to air, land, and sea, but it has very unique requirements in terms of how it's organized, how you train, how you equip, and it has very unique doctrine in terms of how to deploy its forces in order to deliver combat power to the space in the space warfare domain in support of air, land, and sea. So that, again, there's uniqueness in how it approaches its mission that's separated from what the other forces do. And finally, while space is an integral part of the joint warfighting operation, it also has its distinct role. Finally, I would comment, there's been a lot of discussion that goes back a number of years of, well, the Air Force created aerospace, which is true. But for the reasons I just described, there needs to be a separate and distinct entity, but it will be supported by the Air Force in terms of infrastructure. So we don't end up in reinventing the overhead structure of the Air Force just to stand up the Space Force. So things like personnel management, things like finance, and that sort of thing are going to continue to be provided by the Air Force to the Space Force. Now, one of the things that I thought I wanted to put across, and for those who can see this slide and not read it, it will not be tested at the end of this presentation. But in terms of space, I wanted to find a chart, and this was from a 2001 Space Commission report. The number of organizations that think they have something to say about space, and it is legion. And it creates an environment where it's very difficult to move quickly in the space domain. And so we're looking at standing up Space Force as a means of not unhooking entirely from the interested parties, but having a much more responsive approach to dealing with this critical matter. So to put it in the context of the Department of Defense, what you see in the upper left corner of the slide in the dashed blue lines are the three departments: Army, Navy, and Air Force. And their role is to organize, train, and equip the forces, as shown in the lower right-hand part of the slide, in the Unified Combatant Commands, who will use the capabilities provided by the departments to then deter, defend, and deliver combat power. And as indicated in the upper right, you have the Joint Chiefs who are responsible for advising the Secretary of Defense, the President, and other key players on how to apply those forces appropriately in various circumstances. So let's focus specifically on the Space Force and zooming into that part of the slide. The Space Force, much like the Marines, are a co-equal branch of the military, but report into the Department of the Navy. The Space Force will report into the Secretary of the Air Force. And the Chief of Space Operations, four-star General Jay Raymond, long-term space leader, is the first so-called Chief of Space Operations, the head of the Space Force. And again, the mission here, as with other services reporting into the departments, the Space Force will organize, train, and equip and provide capabilities to the Joint Force. That Joint Force, in the case of space, is in the combatant commands, is the U.S. Space Command, who employ those forces in order to deter, defend, and deliver combat power in this space warfare domain, again, as part of the overall integrated Joint Force. And I would comment that the Chief of Space Operations is also the commander of the Space Command, so he has one foot in the organized, train, and equip world, and the other foot in the combatant command world. That is unique, and it was done with intent to, as we stand up this entity of the Space Force, to ensure that we have clear lines of authority defined, and that position will be dual-headed per the Defense Authorization Bill or Act of 2020 for a period of 1 year. That might go on a bit longer, I suspect, but that's its current charter. One other thing I would point out on this slide in the lower right, our intelligence collection satellites are developed and fielded and operated by an organization called the National Reconnaissance Office. And it is owned jointly, if you will, by the Department of Defense and the Director of National Intelligence Organization. And that has worked okay, but in this world where a threat may be coming, and you have an integrated support from space to ground, the last thing you want to do is have to call a committee meeting to decide who's in charge of whose satellites. And so there is now a significant and signed off agreement that if the ball goes up and conflict gets declared and space assets are threatened, it will be U.S. Space Command that provides direction to the NRO on how to protect its intelligence satellites. And I think this is a major improvement in how we position ourselves in this environment. The other thing I would point out that's been added that is unique relative to where we were before with space, within the Department of Defense, there are a number of different entities that acquire satellite systems. And in particular, within the Air Force, there's several different organizations. The Defense Authorization Act created a brand new Assistant Secretary position solely focused on space acquisition and integration. And that person's responsible for the whole architecture and integration of space capabilities. They chair a new forum also laid out in the Defense Authorization Act called the Space Force Acquisition Council, which consists of the Chief of Space Ops, the Commander of U.S. Space Command, the Undersecretary of the Air Force, the Space Acquisition Executive, also created by the Authorization Act, who is the person who actually is going to go buy this stuff, an Assistant Secretary for Space Policy, and the Director of the National Reconnaissance Office, getting back to this view that this is an integrated team effort across all the elements in the Department of Defense, and in this case, the joint element within the intelligence world. And finally, we have, as I mentioned, service acquisitions focused solely on space systems and programs, again, trying to work to a very streamlined approach to acquisition for these capabilities to provide them to the field sooner than has been historical. In terms of the stand-up plan, I've indicated in my prior comments that the Space Force was authorized in 2020 in the National Defense Authorization Act. It provided in fiscal 20, which really only had about 3 months to go when the act was signed, $72 million in funding. And the Space Force for the fiscal year that's about to start, or is actually underway now, has requested some $15.5 billion. And I'll shift to a subsequent slide and then come back. That is a big number. but it's not a number that's created as an adder for the most part to the defense budget, because most of it is funding that's shifting from the Air Force line to the Space Force line. About $10 billion for research, development, test, and evaluation. That's up about $500 million that Congress appropriated in 2020. That $500 million is focused on looking at Space Force unique capabilities. $2.5 billion for procurement of satellites and launch services. That's no change from what Congress had appropriated in the prior year to the Air Force. $2.5 billion for operations and maintenance. That's $300 million more than the Congress enacted in the prior year with the Air Force, and again tied to unique Space Force capabilities. And finally, $100 million for war-related services. Read that as support to the warfighter in the field. Again, that is the plus up relative to prior years. So out of this $15.4 billion, only about $800 million of it is actually a unique adder to the Space Force itself. As I mentioned earlier, General Raymond has been appointed the Chief of Space Ops as the first commander, as well as the commander of U.S. Space Command, again, providing flexibility during the stand-up of this set of organizations. We talked about the Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Acquisition and Integration, and that person has now been through congressional approval, or Senate approval, and in place. And what are these people doing? What is going on right now is they're focused on establishing a fully functioning headquarters. They have assigned, and what that means is some 16,000 people that were in the Air Force part of Space Command as of December, but they are not yet part of the Space Force. They're basically detailed over to the Space Force. And what's going to happen over the next 18 months or so is a subset of those will actually be transferred. About 6,400 military and 3,500 civilians will move over and actually occupy positions within the Space Force formally, with other services, the Navy and Army, to follow suit with some of their personnel. I would say that there has been a slowdown in this process due to the pandemic and a lot of constraints on moving of people and people availability and things such as that. But this thing is underway, and to include the identification of Air Force bases to be designated as Space Force bases. And finally, in terms of standing this up, Congress is actively and positively engaged, and that those two words, actively and positively, don't always resonate with me when we're talking about the Congress these days, but in this case they are. But they are impatient, and they understand the urgency of this change. They have given the Space Force almost a complete white sheet of paper, a very unusual thing, to establish how to accomplish the mission that it has. They're going to require more insight into how Space Force is going to be spending its unique budgetary and programmatic data. There is a focus on trying to streamline security constraints to the greatest extent. It is a very complex set of security arrangements around U.S. capabilities, and some of that is right hand not always knowing what left hand is doing, and there is a great drive to eliminate those kinds of issues. And finally, the chief of the Space Force has the privilege of status in Congress and in the defense committees and intel committees every 60 days. So this is not going without involvement by Congress, but it is a positive thing, I think, in many respects. So with that as kind of background on the threats, how it's being organized, I'll go to, in summary, just on what I would call important, probably should put important in quotes, but the things that people think about in their spare time. What's our logo going to be? It's shown on this slide. It's still, I think, in evolution. It has this Star Trek-ish kind of a look to it. How are we going to recruit people? What are our uniforms going to look like? What are we going to be called? What's our motto? What's our anthem? Here we have an actual website from the Space Force, not made up, and the head or top takeaway line of it is maybe your purpose on this planet isn't on this planet. I think that might apply to some people other than Space Force people that I might wish this on, but if you're interested, click here. And so it's moving along quickly. On a more humorous note, there have been no end of discussions about uniform ideas. My favorite being the one at the lower left, although I don't think we're going to be quite that technological in our approach. And the one at the upper right is the camo suit that people can wear when they're working in the office of Space Force headquarters or out in the field for ground operations. But again, even that is in discussion. And then finally, for slogan, my favorite is the Buzz Lightyear to infinity and beyond. That was also what people were throwing around was going to happen when they went to budget this thing, and it didn't quite turn out that way. And certainly Elton John's Rocket Man would probably make for a good anthem. The last thing I would say is there is some humor around what the ultimate sidearm ought to be. I happen to have a prototype here, and you can probably hear that in the background and maybe recognize the Space Force lightsaber. But with all that said, some fun kinds of things, but a very serious undertaking, both in terms of the threat and in terms of what's being done to address it. And at this point, I would be pleased to take your questions.
Excellent, John. Well, thank you for that really informative presentation. It was very enlightening to see how far we've gotten. And I have to admit that when you put up the 15 billion with the numbers that have been being thrown around recently for pandemic response, 15 billion pales in comparison. So I'm going to just start with a few questions about where you think we are, as much as you can answer it, where you think we are versus where our adversaries are. So China, you gave the overview of China, Russia, and Iran and some others who are putting together Space Force, but I wondered if you could say it in terms of, organizational readiness, operational readiness.
So I think from an operational perspective, U.S. Space Command as a force, and particularly dominated by Air Force Space Command as the Air Force component, has been around for a long time. The Air Force has been actively engaged in this area, and so even though now we're even putting more emphasis on this as a Space Force, in some respects, to ensure that there is the right emphasis of funding on the capabilities necessary to counter the threats that I cited earlier from the folks you mentioned, the adversaries you mentioned, Maureen. I believe that we have capability in place today. We're looking as we move forward with the Space Force to enhance that capability to be able to address the threats that were described.
Excellent. So I have some questions, so bear with me while I turn my head back and forth. I have a question that says, having just returned from a meeting with Space Force in March, there are two big issues that came up. One, the majority of our satellites look down to Earth and not out to space, so they don't have a 360-degree view of potential threat space. How do we overcome that?
So that's a great question. So there is a program called the Space Fence that provides a capability. The first major facility was being tested in Kwajalein Island, has now been moved to Australia, and there will be at least, I believe, 2 more sites than that will provide a perspective on what's in space with high resolution. So it is definitely looking up. And this, we've always had a certain amount of capability in this regard with the cameras and that sort of thing, but this will be a much more capable system. And that noise in the background, by the way, is my dog who's having a sneezing fit, not me. But in any event, the Space Fence is a major initiative along that line. And then you said there was a second part to the question.
Yeah, so the second part to the question is about our capabilities for launch and recovery. So there's been apparently discussion about needing to get to about 200 launches per year. How are we? Where are we? I know you can't answer maybe the specifics, but are we? How are we going to get to that concept of being able to do multiple launches, which is, almost one a day with launch and recovery capabilities?
So right now, if we look at the national security launches, which includes both intel launches from the National Reconnaissance Office as well as from the military side, we're looking at a relatively small number of launches, and I don't remember the exact number offhand, but probably on the order of I would say 10 or so during a given year. And what is happening now is there is a source selection that's taken place to choose 2 launch providers to split that task between them. The idea being, if one of the launch providers gets in trouble with their system, you have a backup capability. The larger number of launches, I think, are going to be on the commercial side. You have things like SpaceX and their constellation. I think the last I heard, some 4,000 satellites they're looking to put in orbit. They're launching about, in a single launch on one of their SpaceX vehicles, they're looking at about 60 satellites at a time, and they have a pretty good number of those up already. So I think you're going to have a mix of national security payloads as well as the commercial launch providers that are going to be launching commercial type satellites. And it's entirely possible that those 2 sets of providers may in fact be one and the same. The big concern is industrial base. Is there enough industrial base to support the number of launches that's been referenced? On the other hand, is there enough launches in a given time frame that someone can make a business case out of it? And that's the trade that's really being made right now, I think.
Excellent. Thanks, John. We have a question about the recognizing the complexity and the and difficulty of this problem, and adding on to that the challenges that we have with cybersecurity, even terrestrial cybersecurity. How is the Space Force integrating the concept of cybersecurity in their operations, and how will they be contributing to cybersecurity for other operations?
So that's an interesting question, and we didn't really spend much time on this, but U.S. Space Command is both as with any of the combatant commands, has a supporting responsibility to the other commands in the case of providing, for example, GPS data or providing missile warning data. In the area of cyber, they're largely a supported command by Cyber Command, which is another force command within that part of the world. So Space Command is really tightly coupled and dependent upon support from Cyber Command to ensure that its assets are protected, and it in turn allows them to support the other combatant commands in their various missions without undue worry about a cyber threat. Although that is, of course, a concern you have to follow, and that's really the structure of how that responsibility set has been allocated.
Excellent, thank you. I do have a question about comparing our capabilities back. So that slide you gave with the capabilities to the Chinese, Russians, and others. But before I ask you to flip back to your slides, I'm going to give you another question, which is when you started to talk about Space Force, I'm sure several people thought the same thing. It kind of reminds you of the early days of the Air Force when we spun off NASA. So then the question to you is really about how do the mission and the operations between the Space Force and NASA fit together, particularly when it comes to things like missions to the moon? Are they separate and apart? How will they be comparing or coordinating their operational space in space?
So I think certainly maybe a good example of collaboration, if you will, is what's taken place with launch vehicles. We have launch providers in the form of SpaceX, as well as Jeff Bezos's Blue Origin, who are looking to have not only launch vehicles that play in putting up satellites, but also in terms of extraterrestrial, interplanetary kind of things in the long term. There is a common technology base that's evolving across this. That there is, I think, more collaboration between NASA and the department on a variety of things that have evolved over time. I would also point out that the recently named director of the National Reconnaissance Office for our intelligence satellites, in fact, is a long-term NASA person, and has provided some connectivity, additional connectivity between the activities. In terms of operations, I don't really see the operations as being integrated. I see it as technology being integrated, and perhaps launch capability being integrated over time, but not so much mission, I guess I would say.
Okay, so I have a few questions that you may or may not be able to answer, so answer what you can. The first question is about combat assets. Does the Space Force have its own combat assets? In particular, the question referenced the X-37B space plane, and are those combat assets distinctly different from the Air Force? And will it have, sort of an operational capability? Human. What hardware will make it unique?
So I really can't comment on the specifics of operational capabilities. There certainly are activities to ensure that we have capability to counter the threats that were described. but that's about the level of detail, unfortunately, I can get into in this conversation.
Understood. Thank you. And let's see, we've got about 5 minutes. So if you, well, let me see. I think I've got one more question. Okay. So I have one more question from our audience. When and I'm going to do my best to give you the whole question. When up to 60 satellites can be included in a single launch by the United States, other nations are certainly going to be able to do the same. Given that cost, with the notion of launching so many satellites, and as we know, launching satellites creates debris. It is hugely expensive. How are we protecting the most critical assets that we've got? And I don't mean you to be specific, but is the Space Force responsible for cleaning up space debris that could impact its own satellites?
So that's actually a great question. I don't think I have this slide in the package, but there is a large amount of objects that are up there already, and we're talking about adding more. The orbit altitudes tend to be, as I recall it, they're looking at the 600 to 1200 kilometer altitude range, and if you work, this is going to sound moronic, but there is a lot of space in space when you look at even that far out, and so the way this works and has worked in the past, and will depend upon as the answer to an earlier question on how do we look up and determine what's there. We have greater precision now that's coming online for seeing what's in orbit. There is an ability to alert the satellite owners, whether they be commercial or military or intelligence, on, hey, there's something that could be a risk to you. You need to do a maneuver to adjust out of it. But right now, I would say certainly there is an increase of potential risk. But when you look at the probabilities of an encounter, they still tend to be relatively small, given the huge volume of space that we're talking about.
Excellent. Thank you, John. I have a sort of practical question, if you will. Who's the space cops? Who determines who's up and who's where and in what orbit and when, and how is that being coordinated? Obviously, because we're not the only ones up there.
So there is there is communication on what's going up. The honest answer is no one can say they're in charge. The odds of us being able to tell the Chinese or the Russians you can or can't isn't particularly high. But there is certainly communication within the various U.S. government agencies about what goes where, and it is more of a collaborative venture than I would say a police state thing. There is less communication with our adversaries about where they're putting stuff, and so the whole need to have an upward-looking monitoring and alert capability is really essential. So we know when someone launches, we know where those satellites end up in orbit, so we can in fact track and have our guys avoid collisions on our side. Not the best answer, I suspect, but there is no. And I'm not sure I need another United Nations committee, but there is no committee on this subject that really can decide for everybody those kind of constraints.
Excellent. Well, I'm going to give you one last question since you ended on a humorous note. There is a question about what your thoughts are, or perhaps are you starring in the new Netflix comedy that is due to be released called Space Force.
I not heard of that, but and last I checked, I have no starring role. Although I am equipped at this if necessary. But I would look forward to hearing that. I will tell you a funny story. So General Raymond, who is leading the Space Force, told this story recently. He was on a tour over to visit troops in theater, and some comedian was on the plane with him, but had no idea who General Raymond was or what he commanded or anything. And it turned out when this comedian launched into his shtick with the forces, he was roasting the Space Force. And the general said, it was funny as heck. He said, and there needs to be that kind of humor in the midst of trying to stand up something as complex as a new service. And so I think this movie probably would be right in the vein, would be my guess.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, John. Thank you for your time. Thank you, everybody who joined us. It was great to see all the NSFers popping up. And we look forward to having you in our next virtual meeting. I wish everybody to stay safe during this time. And we hope that we will get to see you again in person soon. But in the meantime, stay tuned for our next virtual program.